So fingerprints were biometric 1.0, facial recognition was biometrics 2.0, and emotion recognition is biometrics 3.0.
Hi, I'm Nidhi.
Hi, I'm Shashank.
Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Today we're talking to Vidushi about artificial intelligence and emotional recognition technology. Hi, Vidushi. Thanks so much for taking out the time to join us. It's great to have you. We would like to start with asking you a bit about yourself. Can you introduce yourself, talk a bit about your background and the work you've been doing lately?
Sure, thank you for having me on the podcast, and I'm happy to be here. My name is Vidushi Marda. I am a lawyer by training, and I research and work on artificial intelligence in societies. So my work spans technical standardization of these systems. It spans policy development and regulation around AI, and also just trying to understand what AI means in everyday life, the impact that it has on individuals and communities. And while I work internationally and have been involved in policy development in multiple jurisdictions, most recently in the EU, most of my research in trying to uncover how these systems are designed, built, used, and finally how they impact societies, most of that has been in the majority world. So I've done work on predictive policing in India, emotion recognition in China, CCTV surveillance in Myanmar, so on and so forth. And happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, Vidushi. It's great to have you here. We're very excited to talk about artificial intelligence. I think everybody has been talking about it recently. So I'll start with a really broad question. Will AI take over the world, or do you think it already has?
Will AI take over the world in the way that Silicon Valley wants you to think it will? And will AI kill us? And will we have, killer robots in the Terminator? Not in my lifetime, and not in the next generation's lifetime, is my point of view. I think maybe just because this is the beginning of the conversation might help to kind of zoom out a little bit, right? So what is AI? What is artificial intelligence? It's existed as a term for like decades, for 6, 7, 8 decades at this point, right? I couldn't point to one specific thing. One kind of event that people always point to is something called the Dartmouth Conference, where they came up with this term artificial intelligence. And broadly speaking, it's a field of computer science that tries to get machines to mimic intelligent human behavior. Right? So it's the broad field, but there is no one agreed upon definition of AI. So it has existed for 60, 70, 80 years, and the seeds of it were sown maybe decades and centuries ago. And the reason we're hearing about it so much right now is because we have more data than we ever had before. Computing is much cheaper, and it's at the cheapest that it's ever been, right? Everyone has a computer, a phone, a laptop. And also there's been a lot of time that has been devoted to creating this media image and kind of like popularizing this idea that AI is taking over the world, right? So that's my kind of zoomed out version of it. Much of what we talk about AI and much of what we call AI today is actually machine learning, which is the most popular technique of artificial intelligence, which uses data to improve a computer's performance over time. So AI has taken over the world in a really subtle, unsexy kind of way, which is that it is in almost every part of your daily life, right? Like if you're ordering food on Swiggy, it's an algorithm that's helping you do so. Your recommendation systems that underlie all of social media, the recommendation systems that decide how much your cab costs and which cab gets which rider, so on and so forth. All of that is powered by AI. It's powered by a very specific, narrow type of AI. So it is prevalent in society and it is pervasive because we use it on a minute-to-minute, hourly basis, but it's not going to take over in the sense of killing us all. I hope I've made my stance super clear, and yeah.
Awesome. I'd love to hear that AI is not going to take over the world from you. But getting into the conversation that, we've invited you for really, and it's helpful to give that context that you gave on AI. But let's get into it. Vidushi, we know you've written a lot about this, but what is emotional recognition technology, right? And why is it important for us to know about it or study its implications?
So emotion recognition is a biometric application, and it is the premise of emotion recognition is that it uses machine learning to be able to tell you something useful and something discrete about a person's inner emotional state, right? So it is an attempt to identify an individual's inner emotional state and then also categorize it into things such as anger, sadness, happiness, disgust, so on and so forth. So it's a biometric application. I think of it almost as like the next step from face recognition. So face recognition kind of asks the question of who is this person, and emotion recognition is asking like, what does this person feel? What is this person going to do next? Right? Like, what are the inner emotions of this person? So it's really important to know and think about emotion recognition and also pay attention to how the market for it is evolving for a couple of reasons. The first is that it has a really seductive kind of narrative that most governments and definitely the private sector kind of lap up, right? So if you go to like any state anywhere in the world and you tell the state actor, I can tell you what people are thinking and I can tell you what they're going to do in the future, that is a narrative that seems to unfortunately work, right? So it's going to be more and more widespread in the coming years if we don't do something about it. So that's the first. The second is that all of the conditions that you need for emotion recognition to bloom are already in place. So, we had CCTVs become popular in the 1990s, and like the infrastructure for CCTVs is so well, established right now in most places in the world, right? And then on top of that, we have face recognition. Like the earliest instance of face recognition that I could find in a public domain is from 2001. So that's when it slowly started, but it really only got popular around 2017, 2018. And so you have these AI-enabled cameras that were added on to CCTV as like the next logical step. So not only can you see what's going on, but you can see who it is and identify this person, so on and so forth, right? And emotion recognition, many companies, for instance, call it biometrics 3.0. Some companies think it's just the next logical step from face recognition. So there's really very little friction that stops companies and governments from using this technology. And perhaps the most important and alarming thing about emotion recognition is that it simply doesn't work. Right, so it is pseudoscience, it is pseudoscientific technology that's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. The foundations of emotion recognition, which we can get into in a moment, have been criticized from the time that they were first published. But this pseudoscience has been legitimized by the uses and by, actual like consequential things happening because of this technology in a way that's really unaccountable, but also dangerous and fundamentally challenges our idea of human dignity and the exercise of human rights.
And before we get into, the challenges and the problems with emotional recognition technology itself, just to understand what you were explaining about what the technology is and to illustrate with an example, are you saying that, let's say, if I'm sitting for a hiring interview and there's a camera present in that room, so then can the sort of my prospective employer record me and then sort of guess my emotions, whether sort of tendencies of violence or I'm a sort of unreliable employee? Can you talk a bit by illustrating the uses with an example just for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So exactly like you said, right? People's external facial appearance is now increasingly being used to make inferences and assumptions about what kind of person that person is. So if you notice, increasingly in hiring decisions, especially, companies are asking potential employees to send in a video recording of them, right? A video kind of sample of them talking or answering an interview question, so on and so forth. And a lot of that is to do with like, oh, is this person, do they have problems with their concentration? Do they exhibit certain signs of aggression? Do they exhibit certain signs of deception? Are they lying to us? So on and so forth. And all of this is basically pseudoscience, right? Like human emotions are so complex. We usually have more than one emotion going at the same time. But essentially what these systems are doing is that they're working off one template that has its own biases and so on and so forth, and deciding whether you get the job or not. So that's one example. The second example is, I think in the beginning of 2021, the Lucknow police kind of released this safe city tender that they had, and they said, we're going to use AI to be able to identify distressed women on the street. And if we see a woman in distress, then we're going to send in like backup because we want to make Lucknow really safe. And that is assuming that a certain amount of distance between your eyebrows or a certain look in your eye or a certain kind of frown or smile or whatever will tell you enough about a person's inner emotional state to be able to take a consequential decision about where to deploy law enforcement or not, right? Similarly, emotion recognition is also used at migration and border settings. So like at airports, in multiple places, you have emotion recognition systems that check for signs of deception. So at an immigration line, is this person lying to us? Is this person going to go back in a week? Are they going to stay as undocumented citizens, so on and so forth? So those are some examples.
Thanks, Vidushi. I think we all really enjoyed watching all of the TV shows and sci-fi relating to micro expressions that were coming up a few years ago, but in practice, they're not quite as fun. Actually, I wanted to talk about something that you just introduced. So you've talked a little bit about the differences between how this technology is being used in Europe and in India. And in your work, you've also talked about how the market for ERT is growing in India, which I think is a really important conversation to consider because there's not a lot of work in global majority contexts around this. So can you talk a little bit more about how they're using it in India, what we can see coming up in the next few years?
Before I answer you, I love The Mentalist. I still watch it to this day just because I find it entertaining, but it just has, it's not scientific, as the protagonist will tell you himself. So in India, we're seeing a bunch of things happen, right? So first of all, most emotion recognition applications and offerings in the market aren't called emotion recognition. They're called like employee tracking, or they're called workplace surveillance, or they're called an interview assistant. Like there are lots of different names for it. I think the question is someone using a biometric application to apparently be able to determine someone's emotional state? So we're seeing this at the stage of interviews. We're seeing this at the stage of employees at work being assessed for their performance. We're seeing some instances where there are use cases of stand in front of this billboard and look at facial expressions of people to see whether they like the ad or not. These are all usually in trial mode, but I think the place where they're most perhaps well embedded is in the interview and kind of recruitment space, also because it's like a purview of private organizations. And so there's very little that we know. In fact, I'm currently working on a project that is trying to map all of the different companies that are doing this in India and trying to figure out, like, where is the surveillance moving from just like movement and identity to emotion. And so I think there are a couple of things that are different, right? So the first is that, like in Europe, for instance, I've been quite heavily involved in the EU AI Act, and we've been like doing briefings with members of the European Parliament. We've been sending in written notes and briefing documents and all of these things about why emotion recognition should be banned. And as of now, the European Parliament has voted to ban emotion recognition in key use cases, which was a huge win. Like, I didn't think that we'd get it. Excellent organizations such as EDRI and Access Now have been like leading on this work really for a very long time. And it was a privilege to be able to work with them, because just to see like what works, right? Like what narrative actually works. So I have been in situations where, I won't name the party, but we were doing a briefing, and like the questions that I was asked was like, well, I do smile when I'm happy and I do frown when I'm sad. So what's wrong with this? And that piece of like prompt, or, that piece of like assumption, if you will, itself took us like many, many years to kind of like break down and demonstrate that it doesn't work at scale. And so the difference, the one big difference is that there's an active conversation about what regulation of these systems looks like and what it should be in Europe. Whereas in India, I think that firstly, because we're at the data protection stage as of now. Secondly, we haven't decided what kind of AI regulation we're going to even have, right? Is it going to be umbrella AI regulation? Is it going to be sectoral? Is it going to be application specific? We don't know. So that conversation is not happening. And because the regulatory conversation is not happening, I think there's a lot less friction in India when it comes to what is being used, what can be trialed, what can be marketed, what can be sold in India compared to Europe. Now, turn your gaze to China, and it's a whole other ball game, but it's also very similar in some ways. So in China, work that I did with Shazida Ahmad back in 2021, so I'm sure it's changed a little bit at least, but I think the high-level findings will still stand, is that there is a concerted effort by states, universities, companies, academic departments to push for this technology, right? So it's not just like the private sector is pushing for this and the government is lapping it up. It's very much a concerted effort of like different actors coming together to champion this technology. In China, for instance, the education use cases of AI systems was like the most popular. It was covered in the newspapers. It received a lot of pushback. I actually haven't seen, surprisingly, I haven't seen that kind of use or pushback in India. Now, it could be because it's being marketed as like, oh, this is like a class leader or something, right? Like they're not using the words emotion recognition, so they don't show up in my searches, and that would probably need like a lot more careful research around it. But that to me is like one anomaly and one thing that's quite surprising. So if your listeners or if you or if anyone like, comes across some sort of education use case where emotion recognition is being used, I would be very interested to learn more and see how that's being put to use. So the other use cases, the other possible use cases are things like, when you're being assessed for a loan, when you're like going in for an appointment with the doctor, those kinds of things. I haven't seen them crop up in India, at least in the media. So I can't say that that is prevalent, but, I keep an eye out.
That's super interesting, Vidushi. And, as you were talking about smiling and happiness and frowning and sadness, I'm like, well, humans are more complex than that. It's not just that what I'm showing outwardly is what I'm feeling, inside. So it's very interesting when you sort of link it to the use cases. Also, India has been taking a lot of techno solutionism and implementing it across various zones, right? That also ties into the kind of examples you were getting into law enforcement, education, tech apps using cameras to sort of analyze children's expressions and then sort of make assumptions that you're suggesting maybe not correct. The other thing is that we're so desensitized to CCTV cameras in India. I think some of the largest cities in India are the most under CCTV surveillance. So it'll be interesting to see how the use of those cameras, then ERT can be applied over those, right? But I like to sort of steer the conversation into challenges. It's natural that there are some data privacy and data protection challenges. Obviously prodding you to talk about those, but in your work, you've said that it's not just privacy challenges. Like there's a sort of inherent power imbalance between who makes this technology and who gets subjected to this technology. Can you discuss a bit about that?
That's a big answer, and I'm trying to figure out how best I want to organize it. Okay, so let's for a moment like look at what data protection does, right? Like why does data protection exist? So data protection exists so that the entity that is collecting the data and the person, the individual whose data is being collected, or increasingly maybe even communities or groups, that there is some way of balancing the scales in terms of what happens to individuals' data. So data protection is really, at least to my mind, it is a mechanism through which the entity collecting data is required to behave in order to maintain some sort of accountability and also maybe safeguards people's privacy down the line. I mean, we all know the link between data protection and privacy isn't as direct as that, but that is the ultimate aim, right? So when we think about data protection in that sense, it's assuming that data will be collected, right? It is intervening at the point at which data is collected, and then it's telling you what to do. So I'm just going to take that first piece and leave it to the side. So the second thing we have to ask is, what is emotion recognition, right? So I know I've spoken about use cases and I know I've spoken about, like broadly what it does. But if I had to really break it down and explain it in a consequential way to you and to your listeners, it would be this. So it is based on something called basic emotion theory by Paul Ekman. And this came out in the 50s. And basic emotion theory basically says two things, right? The first is that there is a link between a person's outwardly appearance and their inner emotional state. That's the first assertion or the assumption, whatever you want to call it. The second is that human emotions are discrete. Anger is anger, sadness is sadness, happiness is happiness. And that these emotions are expressed uniformly across cultures. So actually, like if I had to really simplify it, it would be three assertions, right? The first about the link between your outwardly appearance and your inner emotional state. The second about the fact that emotions are discrete. And the third is that they are equally and like uniformly expressed across cultures. All three assertions have been debunked from the time that they came out. So basically, this has no scientific rigor. Like we all know that I can feel sad and I can feel angry at the same time. I can feel happy and confused and sleepy at the same time, right? Or like everyone knows that Indians are made fun of, not particularly tasteful ways, by people in the West because we shake our head, right? And that means something here. Whereas nodding in one culture could mean something like totally different to another culture where shaking your head means the same thing. So we know that emotions and emotional expressions, and especially facial expressions, are filtered through culture. So they are not uniformly, I don't know why I'm struggling to say that word, expressed across cultures. And so all of the building blocks of this basic emotion theory are pseudoscience. So that's the second block so the first block was data protection, what it does, right? The second is basic emotion theory. And the third is emotion recognition systems in use. So when you use something like facial recognition, right? If it says you are Shashank or you are Nidhi, there is a verifiable way of saying yes or no. You got it right or you got it wrong, right? So if I identify Nidhi as Shashank and Shashank as Nidhi, you can tell me I'm wrong. When it comes to emotion recognition, there's no way to prove or to disprove what I was feeling. Like maybe I'm particularly emotionally like avoidant or something, and when I find something sad, I laugh. And you might think that it seems like it's funny to me, but to me it's like deeply sad, but I'm just unable to express it because of, and so there is no way of proving or disproving the assumption about me being true or not. Now take that in a context of a classroom, take that in the context of a border like check. If a border official tells you, well, you're showing signs of deception, and I say, well, I'm not, there's no way to prove or disprove that he's wrong and I'm right. It's just that the more powerful word kind of wins. So let's take the three things, right? Data protection assumes the data will be collected. It tells us how the entity collecting data should behave. Emotion recognition fundamentally is broken. It doesn't work. It's based on like these discredited legacies of physiognomy and phenology. I'm sorry to throw these words at you, but like if people are interested, look into those kind of legacies and see how much destruction they've caused in the past. And the third is thinking about how these systems are used, as researchers would call, in the wild. So it's almost a non-starter to say what should data protection do about emotion recognition, because even if a data protection law says emotion recognition or emotion data or biometric data is highly sensitive, you have to be super careful with it, you can never share it with anyone, you have to delete it within a day. If an entity is collecting this data and making inferences or decisions based on this data, it is still using pseudoscience to make consequential decisions. Data protection has nothing to do with the harms that the system kind of like poses to society, right? Like it's not a privacy issue, it's a surveillance issue, it's a power issue, it's a dignity issue. Like who are you to decide what I'm feeling and then penalize me or reward me for it? So which is why like I've taken the stance in my writing over the years to say that the only legitimate data protection approach to emotion recognition is to say that this is not allowed. We don't allow you to collect it. That's the only thing that data protection can do. And then it's other regulation, it's the responsibility of other regulators, whether it's sectoral or like if India goes down the EU road, if we have an umbrella kind of legislation to say, kind of like what Europe has done, to say that it will not be used. There's no redeeming quality of this system that would allow us to use it.
As you were talking, I know you've written about it, that it doesn't consider, for example, neurodivergent people and how their sort of emotions might be expressed on their face or externally, and what's the link to the internal bit. I think what I found interesting through your writing is also Vidushi. Yeah, you want to jump in? Please go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really important point, actually. Sorry to interrupt you, but essentially the neurodivergent piece is actually the most confusing one to me. Personally, I'm not neurodivergent. So even though I am an AI researcher and I've studied these technologies, talking to people who are neurodivergent, and also talking to many bodies who work with people with different kinds of disabilities, we've learned that some people think that it might be helpful. So I have like a systemic issue with this, to say that an emotion recognition company has no expertise to move into the healthcare space just because it has this technology that is apparently, helping certain types of people benefit from it. So that's one issue that I have. But the other issue that I come to very humbly is to say, I just simply don't have that lived experience. So even in our recommendations, like as a civil society coalition in Europe, for instance, we said that with the exception where affected communities ask for access to this technology, we will not recommend using these technologies or allowing these technologies to come on the market at all. And that's an important thing to also consider. Like I can be super confident about my research and my assertions about this technology and it not working, but I don't, and I don't think any researchers who don't have that lived experience should talk for communities who might want it. Sorry, Shashank, you were saying.
No, absolutely, Vidushi. And that brings me to my other comment that I was making, is that what I found interesting through your writing is the pointing to power imbalances, right? That's something that as a privacy researcher has really struck me as well, that the whole point of data protection should be to try and balance those imbalances. And like we're talking about neurodivergent people, obviously, and other technologies, we should get more people to talk about this, people who have the lived experience, get them included in the conversation. But yeah, I'll hand it over to Nidhi now.
Thanks, Shashank. I think that was a really interesting conversation, and I kind of want to take it a little forward. I know we talked about how you can potentially regulate this technology. So you already have had the data protection bill. It took a few years, but it's here now. And then you have some more legislation upcoming, hopefully, which might potentially be regulating AI. We're not sure in what shape or form, but you will have that as well. But there's one more thing that we can consider here, and that's the current conversations happening around FRT regulation, which is mostly being done in courts right now. So I know we briefly touched upon this earlier, but you have so many CCTV cameras in many cities in India. You even have legal use of them inside classrooms in certain cases. So when we're looking at ERT regulation, now, of course, we could wait for an AI regulation. Do you think that maybe the FRT case might be a good place to make an argument about why, when you're using these cameras, you should immediately ban any of their uses for emotion recognition technology?
Yeah, I think there are actually two questions in your question, right? So the first is like, what is the approach we want to take in India when it comes to AI regulation? So for instance, the Chinese approach has been to take a technology by technology approach. They have a generative AI regulation, they have a social media regulation, they probably have different types of regulations for different types of technologies. The second is like the European version, which is like we have an umbrella legislation for all things that we consider AI, and then we tell you what's allowed, what's not within that world. And then the third, which I see emerging in the US, but I don't think that, it's set in stone in any way, is like sectoral regulation of like, we're going to regulate medical devices, we're going to regulate law enforcement, we're going to regulate so on and so forth. So when it comes to the Indian context, I feel like the first question is going to be, what kind of approach do you want? Having given you that kind of preface, I will say that the regulation of emotion recognition needs to be distinct from facial recognition, because I worry that when we kind of club the two, we legitimize emotion recognition, right? So like facial recognition can work. In theory, it can be made more accurate. It can reach 100% accuracy. It can be measured for accuracy of like 2%, 3%. I got it right, I got it wrong, right? So that's a different conversation from it simply does not work. And everything that it's telling you is just fiction, and it's giving you the illusion of control and knowing stuff that you absolutely don't. So if I had to use the framework of the Chinese company, right? So fingerprints were biometric 1.0, facial recognition was biometrics 2.0, and emotion recognition is biometrics 3.0. I don't subscribe to this idea at all, but that's just how it's being sold by one particular prominent company in China. Or if you look at it as like the next logical step from facial recognition, right? It brings up fundamentally new questions. And so I think that it requires a distinct and very like ground up approach to regulating it. And it can't piggyback off of the facial recognition example. Just because I think that there might be cases in which, like with a court order and in very narrowly tailored circumstances, we might want to use facial recognition for certain limited use cases when it's an exceptional circumstance of national security, blah, 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 right? But with emotion recognition, if something doesn't work, we have to talk about it with that level of dismissiveness, I think.
Actually, I think this brings a really interesting question that a lot of people haven't considered, is that once you have sufficiently advanced technology, what happens when the aim of the technology is entirely wrong? People just assume that since you're talking about technology, it must follow some sort of rules of science and you will follow it to some sort of a logical conclusion. But in cases like emotional recognition technology, I think no matter how much you fix it, like you said, if the aim of it is wrong, that the you can't recognize emotion and the theory that it's built on is incorrect, then there's no point to having that function in the first place. I'll pass over to Shashank now.
Can you discuss some harms that may arise from the use of emotion recognition technology? Right, we've spoken about the use cases. My guess is that in India, because we're so sold on the promise of technology and how technology can solve life's all problems, I'm worried that private players will be able to sort of sell this, as you're pointing to, wrong idea of emotional recognition technology. I'm sure in your work you've sort of come across various stories, various anecdotes on what are the harms that are suffered. And I'm not just talking about privacy harms, right? Generally, if it's discrimination as well.
Yeah, so I think the overarching fundamental, just unacceptable harm is that it violates the very idea of human dignity, right? It breaks down your being and it ascribes a certain value and a certain inner dialogue and possibly even future action to that person without their consent or their participation, and gives them no avenue for appeal. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it also collects sensitive personal information about you and then makes consequential decisions based on that. And there is little to no regulation on how it can be collected, so on and so forth. But my skepticism with data protection, so that to me is like the least important harm. But a lot of the basic emotion theory stuff and a lot of the data sets that we have as of now when it comes to emotion is primarily tested on men and white men. So this is where a similarity comes with facial recognition, where like it is fundamentally problematic because it's going to further isolate communities and people who have been isolated by the state or by authorities for decades and for centuries, and that will continue to be the case without giving them any kind of chance to appeal, the wrongs, so the discrimination. But also, I think, one of the things that I read right at the beginning when I started this work was some companies in China, for instance, are saying, like, we need to collect more Chinese face data to be better with these systems. So like the argument of like, oh, just make it more accurate it's like doubly dangerous, because firstly, you're collecting more data and you're surveilling more people towards no particular end. It's just like an open-ended exercise. But the second is like you're surveilling them for a purpose that isn't legitimate in the first place. So not only does it increase like surveillance, it also increases discrimination under the guise of reducing discrimination, and it's just like a total mess, right? And one of the papers that I think is really instructive and is definitely the reason that I even got into this world in the first place is this paper by Professor Lauren Rue, where she essentially tested a bunch of APIs that used emotion data on NBA players. And those APIs always classified Black NBA players who were smiling as being super angry. And so like that, if you think of that in more consequential situations, like who are the people who are worried about crossing border security? It's not white people. It's definitely not white men, right? It's usually people of color, women, migrants, people moving countries, people fleeing countries. And so they're already stressed about like the existence of immigration and paperwork and so on and so forth. And then you add the pressure of emotion recognition technologies that are inherently biased against them and based on pseudoscience to then harass them further or to deprive them of opportunities. And that just like the whole puzzle is just a disaster.
Yeah, and anyway, international travel for whoever can afford to is so difficult, and you're pointing out to some sort of more problems there. I know that you've spoken about the challenges with looking at this problem from a data protection lens, but it is the flavor of the season for us here. India just passed its data protection law, and it has a provision of exempting companies who have employees from notifying their sort of employees on certain data protection or data processing that they do. I'm just thinking at ERT from that perspective, right? A lot of times we don't even know that various technologies, whether FRT or ERT or even other surveilling technologies, are even we're being sort of run through those technologies. And I sort of fear that these kind of exemptions to companies where they don't need to sort of notify their employees that certain technologies are not, they're sort of being run on certain technologies, is sort of a bit problematic, right? Any thoughts there?
Oh, super problematic. It's not just a bit problematic. Like, I think just because someone employs me doesn't give them the right to invade my rights in a sense that is not fair or that isn't directly connected to business goals, and not business goals in like the fully capitalist, we don't care about people kind of way, but actually like, is it important for you to do this? Is this the most reasonable or fair way in which you want to achieve your final goals? I think that's problematic. The second is that this is what I mean by legislation that legitimizes terrible use cases like emotion recognition. Because what it's saying is you can do whatever you want. You don't have to tell employees what you're doing. And so that you can do whatever you want includes emotion recognition. And in the absence of a provision that says, irrespective of everything else in this act, we do not allow you to use pseudoscientific technologies to make decisions or inferences about people. Short of saying that, you're just legitimizing its use across the board. So that's just my quick response to that.
Thanks, Vidushi. I think the point of this podcast has become really clear. Clearly, this is one of those technologies that we can really only ban. I don't think there's much tempering that we can do in this case. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how this conversation develops. In India, we have so much going on, too much going on, but we have so much going on. We have AI regulation sort of developing, we have the FRT technologies happening. And I guess we'll also find out if our data protection regulators agree with your view and this does, in fact, get banned. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was great having you on board. I'm sure all of our listeners will be very happy to learn about this new technology that is already affecting them. Yes, fingers crossed that this is something that we won't be facing too much in the future.
Thank you so much, Vidushi. We can continue to talk to you for another hour, I guess. But thanks so much for taking out the time. And any closing thoughts from yourself?
No, just thank you for having this conversation and kind of creating this space to talk about these technologies that I think have unfortunately, flown under the radar in India in a way that we really shouldn't have. And yeah, thanks for having me. Good luck.
Thanks so much, Vidushi. Bye-bye.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast was created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.